Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today, I would like to talk to you about documentation. This is going to be how to write documentation, but also why documentation is important, some different kinds of documentation, and how this can be useful to you in multiple instances. So, first, why is documentation important? So, documentation is a record of what's been going on or what happened, sort of at its most fundamental level. Documentation means that you have a record for later reference. You never want to assume that you're going to remember what you did recently, what you did last week, what you did 6 months ago. A good example of this is if I asked you, what have you eaten today? Or what TV shows have you watched today? You'd probably remember and you'd be able to tell me. But what if I asked you those same questions for a month ago, or 6 months ago, a year ago? That's not that far away, but it makes it a lot harder to answer. Documentation also gives you the ability to share information more easily with other people at your company, on your team that you're working with for whatever reason. It gives you a reference for things that need to happen repeatedly, infrequently, or that lots of people need to do. So, for example, if you have to do quarterly reports, that means if you're only doing something once a quarter, it's really easy to not remember what you are doing, how to do it, and all the steps required. If quarterly reports is something that gets passed around your team, having documentation and a checklist so that everybody does the quarterly reports the exact same way so the workload is shared, but you still have a nice, consistent end product, that's really helpful. Having a historical record so that you can see why something is the way it is without having to track down the creator is also really useful. Sometimes you'll be working with something and you'll say, wow, that was a really odd choice. I wonder why they made it. And sometimes you'll be like, oh, they were in a rush, something was happening, it was a old system detail, legacy code, whatever it happens to be. But with documentation, having that record means that there is an explanation, so it isn't just, I don't know what this does, guess I'll delete it, oh, whoops, there goes our system. Which sounds like a really silly thing, but actually happens more frequently than you might think. Documentation also is a way to have information in one place, or sometimes you'll see to it as a single source of truth that doesn't require somebody else. So you don't have to say, hey, other person on my team, what do I do now? Why is this here? What did we do last quarter? What did we do last year? You have the documentation for that, so you can go look it up and digest that information at a pace that works for you. Documentation can also be important as a record so that there aren't conflicting points of view. So, a common example of this is if you have an issue that gets escalated to HR for whatever reason, having documentation for your side of what's happening ends up meaning that you can say, okay, this is what I have, this is what I see has happened, these are the receipts that I have. Means that you have the ability to sort of have more proof of what you're saying. When we write documentation, sometimes we'll write documentation for other people. So we are designing it so that somebody else could look at our documentation and understand what's going on. We have to think about how our document is organized. Don't just think about this works for me, think about what would work for other people. Make sure that you also have some clarity and that somebody else could follow your train of thought. Now, there are going to be some cases where you're going to want to write your documentation for you and say, oh, I'll remember. This makes perfect sense now. Let me tell you, you will not remember. There are numerous cases, numerous times, every single person I know where they have done a thing. I personally have done this multiple times, but I know other people do too. They've done the thing, and let's say they've written some code. The code works. They look back at the code 6 months later and go, what stupid son of a monkey did this code? And then unfortunately, you'll see the commit and say, oh, I'm the stupid son of a monkey that did this code. And that sort of steps is a very common set of steps. And obviously, not just for code, but for lots of things. You don't want to be that. So Making sure that you have some organization, some clarity, even if you think it's just for you, write it so that it could be used for someone else. Code comments can be used to make sure that the next person using your code has some idea of your thought process. Having some examples and demonstrations are helpful. So if you have some sample data, as in like, I wrote this code to function this way. For example, these two numbers would go in and these four numbers would come out. I am setting up this server in this way. It will look like this if you did it correctly. Those are really good ways of making sure that your documentation is clearly done so that somebody else could follow it easier. Assume your documentation can and will be shared widely. It is unfortunately incredibly common that sometimes people will write things for themselves and not realize that other people will see it. Now, sometimes you're going to say, oh, it's fine, I don't care. But just know that other people will see your writing. Some examples of this, so I kind of called it code comment hell, but you can see a lot of examples online of code comments that were clearly not meant to be shown outside of their own company, that, engineers and developers did not realize other people were reading. So you want to make sure that you are staying professional and appropriate in your comments. Multiple formats are also helpful because you don't know who's going to read your document, you don't know how they understand and process information, and you want to make sure that your document is as useful as possible for as many people as possible. Documentation can actually also be useful for yourself. Now, the documentation we were talking about for others is records of how things work. This is how I set up my system. This is how I wrote my code. This is how I've installed these programs. This is how I do my updates. This is the checklist that I go through every Friday. We can also have documentation for yourself so that you have records to make sure that you remember what happened correctly. Basically, you want the receipts. So documentation can have an amalgamation of options. You can have things like calendars, to-do lists, notes, meeting transcripts, even short thoughts, stuff like that. It's fine. You just have to make sure that it's organized and you can find the thing that you want. Now, there are some examples that I'm going to give of things that you should document for you that's going to be useful for you later. Example number 1, personal accomplishments. Keeping track of personal accomplishments can be really helpful if you have to do 360s or raise and promotion time, or even the sort of not as good you're put on a PIP, personal action plan, and or personal improvement plan. So that personal set of accomplishments can be things like, I was able to save the company X number of dollars this week by doing A, B, and C. I was able to close out 3 product tickets today by 11 a.m. Anything that's sort of a little bit more extraordinary can be included. Be specific, have numbers, have concrete things. This is not where you say, I did such a good job today, gold sticker for me. This is where you're going to do things like, I've saved this amount of money, I've gotten through X number of work, I have completed Y amount of whatever it happens to be. Another example, personal notes. Keeping track of your thoughts and day-to-day work can keep you organized, but it can also mean that you have a record of what you're doing. A good example of this. Does your job description actually match the thing that you do every day? Sometimes it's, yes, it does. Great. Sometimes it's, woof, no. Your job description is about a third or a quarter of the things that you do, and the rest is actually your boss's job description. So then you can say, okay, well, if the things that I have in my records and my personal notes and my day-to-day work, 3/4 of it matches my boss's description, and I'm not getting that raise, salary, promotion, I can give a much more reasonable argument for why I should be getting it if I have these records. And I can show these records to the person that I'm doing my review with. Another example of personal documentation that's really useful is links to documentation that you use frequently or infrequently, or it's really hard to find. Now, there can be different examples of this. Companies will sometimes rework their internal documentation. There are fads, there are reorgs. Sort of the most well known is we have too much middle management. We should go to a flat structure. Oh, our flat structure isn't working. We need to go to a tree structure. And you'll see that sort of, if you stay with the same company for a while, you'll see that happen a lot. And having links to documentation that you know you will need, or having a copy of that and you know where it is, ends up being pretty useful because you don't necessarily want to assume it's always going to be there. Okay, documentation organization. Documentation is only useful if people read it. This is you, this is others. If people do not read your documentation and they cannot find what they want in their documentation, you included, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how good it is. Doesn't matter how useful it is. If nobody can read it, if nobody can find it, if nobody can find the thing that they want, doesn't matter how pretty it is. Kind of a don't care. And so you have to make sure that when you are writing your documentation, you are actually making it useful so that people can find it, they can read it, and they will understand what they're reading. An example of this, if you happen to be a gamer, every now and then when you're gaming, you'll sometimes run into a puzzle and you just get completely stuck and you're about to throw the system or computer through a wall. So you will go look through a walkthrough site. It is likely that you either have a favorite walkthrough site or you go Google search, AI search, whatever, for a walkthrough site. Think about how many times you've gone to a website and said, I have no idea what's going on. Get out of it and go to the next search engine. Think about the attention span that you take before you just sort of throw your hands up and say, no thanks, pass. That's the attention span that you need to grab somebody in for your documentation. That's how quickly you have to get somebody to actually be like, oh yeah, I understand what's going on. I am confident I can find my thing. My thing is in here somewhere. Now, different people do have different theories on documentation. Being clear and concise, always helpful. Some people do tend to over comment, over document, and then we end up with something that could have been 3 pages, 5 pages, and it's actually 40 pages. That gives its own set of issues. Sometimes you'll see this in code commentary. Um, no offense to my students, but I see this all the time in my students where I say, like, hey, make sure you have useful comments. And then they'll do something like I plus plus, and then the comment will be, this increases I by 1. Like, cool. That was super helpful. I'm so thankful I took the time to read that comment. But think about the comments and the documentation that you have, what is necessary, what is clear, what is overdoing it. There is not a one size fits all. There is not a single thing that I can tell you, always do this, never do that, and it will be perfect. Organization changes as documentation evolves. You have to keep it up to date, but there's a whole bunch of different organizational options for documentation. And you have to sort of figure out what makes the most sense for you and the thing you are trying to document. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about the organization, the visual appeal, the ability to find the thing. All of those are important in your documentation. Now, keeping documentation up to date is its own problem. One of the biggest failings with documentation, besides the nobody reading it, is that it gets out of date and nobody fixes it. It can be really hard to remember to fix documentation. Like, I get that, I do. But if you have documentation and you aren't updating it, it's no longer useful. Now, there are going to be some cases where the update may or may not matter. For example, if you are documenting something in Linux, it's very much going to depend on what you are documenting. If you are documenting how to write a shell script, that frankly hasn't changed in the 30 years that I know of doing it. But if you are trying to do something like install a virtual machine, boy howdy, let me tell you how that's changed just in the last 10 years. And so you have to think about the thing that you are documenting and how frequently that needs to be updated to make sure that it is still useful. I'm not saying every GUI change needs to be updated, but if there is a large change or a large visual change, it might be worth thinking about. Fixing documentation should include a schedule of checking to make sure it's up to date. This can include things like documents to change in specific scenarios. You might write a script to check your code examples to ensure validity if you were talking about code. Maybe you keep a change log or version control so that you have a dated record of changes. All of those can be really helpful in making sure that the documentation is kept up to date. You know who's been doing the changes, when the changes were done, the last time the changes were done, and very importantly, what was actually changed. And then this last one is sort of a tip from me to you. Fix anything you notice is an issue right away. Don't assume you'll remember to do it later or that you'll have time to do it later. Um, just saying, oh, yeah, no, I'll totally have time tomorrow, next week, next month. Everything's going to calm down by then. No, it won't. Just, it won't. Okay, technical documentation. When we have technical documentation, you will sometimes see something called an overview or a roadmap. They'll sometimes call it like a high level planning session or the 10,000-foot view or whatever's trendy. And it's basically just how something was put together, the overall organization of the code base, application, network, stuff like that. So, like for a network, you're probably going to have a topology somewhere. You are going to want to keep that general record of the topology so that you know what's connected, how it's connected, and then you're probably going to have some records about each of the nodes in there. Maybe if you have an application, you're going to have an overview of the code base and you're going to have at least some idea of what's connected, where it's connected, how it's connected, things like that. Documentation can be written for anything. You can write it for setting up servers. You could write documentation for scripts. You could do things like write documentation for services that aren't used often. So, like for example, when you have to renew a domain, that is an infrequent process. So, having to renew that every year, maybe you buy 2 years, you want to write down what you did, how you did it, what needs to be changed, make sure there's a calendar reminder. Make sure that you are not the only person that has that calendar reminder and the steps on how to do it if you're in some variety of company, because you want to make sure that if anything goes wrong, there's always fail safes. You want to make sure that the documentation has all of the known steps. Sometimes a really good way to do this is a checklist, because when you have that checklist, it gives you the ability to quite literally check things off as you go to make sure that nothing gets forgotten. If somebody else works with this, they will follow the exact same steps, and it always happens the exact same way every single time. You'll actually see checklists all over the place. I know they're really popular in healthcare, but you'll actually see them all over the place in tech companies too, because having that checklist, whether it's troubleshooting, server or computer setup, network setup, maybe it's backups, anything like that. Having that checklist means that it's always happening the exact same way, and you're never sitting there saying, what did I do last time? What went wrong? What do I need to fix? You always have that written record, making sure that everything is happening the exact same way every time. Technical documentation should be written so that it's accessible to multiple categories of people. Think about your target audience. Is your target audience a brand new intern? Is it a marketing or Marcom department? Is it the other people in IT? Is it a bunch of engineers? Is it somebody sort of in upper level management? Maybe it's C-suite people. And so when you have your target audience, that will tell you how to write your documentation. You know, a whole bunch of network engineers will probably need different style of documentation than your summer interns. You know, network engineers, you might be able to say something like run script. Summer interns, not so much. You would have to say like, okay, find the script, it's located here, run the script by doing this, check the output by doing that. If you saw an error message, do this. Whereas, with an engineer or a programmer, you can say like, run script. So think about your target audience, think about how it's sort of written and what level of detail is needed. A really common form of documentation that you are likely to see frequently is something called README files. README files are used to have setup instructions. It's how to run a script, program, or app, including everything that needs to be installed, how to install it, any dependencies that are required, any little weird quirks. So if you need any special instructions for how to use your script, program, app, a README file is where you're going to have it. Now, I think README files should be there by default, and you should always have one. Even if you end up putting in your README file very little, it's useful. README files are used really commonly so that everybody knows where to look at the instructions. Sometimes they're included by default. Some tools will actually help you set up the script, program, app, and they will, quite literally by default, have a README that you have to fill in. Sometimes it comes with basically nothing, comment or two, some junk text, whatever. README is the first place people look. So the target audience for README is somebody that's never encountered your script, program, app. Assume they know nothing. Assume they can turn on their computer, they know what a mouse is, and they can probably tell the difference between the desktop and a browser. That's about the level that you end up having to go with for a lot of READMEs, because you have to assume they know nothing about the thing they're looking at. And if you have like weird quirks for the script, like you have this set of 3 dependencies, or you have to make a change in a conf file, or it only runs if you put it in this one place, like sure, you know that, but that goes in the README. README files are a really good general overview. Sometimes people will put lots of things in there. They'll put the authors of the program, they'll put the license for the program, script, program, app, whatever. Sometimes you'll actually have other files. So you might have an authors file, a changelog file, a license file. There's some other really common ones. READMEs are almost always useful. There's very few cases where I'd say, yeah, I don't need to bother with a README. Author files, maybe a little less common. Changelogs, very useful. This is what I changed. This is why I changed it. This is when I changed it. A lot of README files are done in a language called Markdown. Markdown is incredibly popular for documentation because it's really easy to learn. Markdown is a very obvious language. It's not a complex thing. There's a lot of guides out there. It's very straightforward. It's nice because if you have visuals in there, the visuals will end up having some alt text so that you can at least get an idea of what's there. Even if it doesn't get rendered, it's still really obvious what's going on. There are a lot of variants of Markdown. So companies will sometimes extend standard Markdown to have extras. Some common ones you've probably seen and may not realize are Markdown. If you are a gamer and you run Discord and you've noticed any of the sort of special like tricks and hacks of Discord, yeah, that's Markdown. So if you know how to do things like add in code blocks or bold or hidden text, the like spoiler alerts, stuff like that, it's all Markdown. GitHub and Reddit, same thing. If you've ever posted on your favorite subreddit, you know that they have the same like spoiler tags, links to other places, stuff like that. All of that's Markdown. Now, another variety of documentation that you may or may not see, depending on how much programming you do, is code comments. Now, this can be a little controversial. Different people will have different philosophies on their code commentary. This can get into these sort of traditional flame wars. People tend to have their philosophy, and wow, do they stick to that philosophy, and darn everybody else. You will likely form your own opinion. It will likely change as you get experience. you're going to get conflicting advice. Everybody is going to have an opinion on comments, what comments you include, how often you comment, how you do your comments. Everybody has their own opinion. At some point, you're just going to have to figure out yours, match it to your sensibilities, your company, whatever. One popular one is the code is the documentation. And this literally means that you should be writing your code so obvious that it is documentation by itself. It doesn't need instructions. Some people will say code documentation is just helpful pointers. Here are some helpful pointers about my code base. Some people will say my code should have documentation and they will have comments every other line. It is what it is. You just end up having to figure out what works for you. If you have a teacher, they probably have some variety of instructions. They've probably explained to you why the instructions are the way that they are, and you just need to follow it. Commonly, you will see something called header comments. This comes before the code. It can include things like authors, a list of variables, function names. It can also have instructions on running the code or usage options. There are different opinions on if this is the way to go. Header comments can also be block comments before each function. It can include things like use cases and examples. Some people are like, oh, yes, this is absolutely necessary. Some people are like, no, I don't care. And you have to figure out what works and what is required for your teacher, company, scenario. There's probably some variety of documentation telling you exactly what you should do, and you have to follow that. Names, also documentation. So function, variable, class names are also part of code documentation. There are some naming conventions out there. Sometimes the naming conventions are done by language. Some languages have specific ones. Sometimes it's by programmer. They have a set of variables that they always end up using. Sometimes it's a philosophy thing where they'll say like, oh, well, mine is always going to be the variable type followed by, what it does, the function that's calling it, and they can get real long. But that can be part of the documentation. Now, I have also included some examples of different ways to set out the variable. Sometimes it's things like all caps or having dashes. So like if you have the phrase my variable, sometimes the M and the V are both capitalized. Sometimes the M is lowercase and the V is capitalized. Sometimes there's an underscore between the my and variable. Sometimes there's a dash between the my and variable. So sometimes it just keeps going. There's a whole bunch. Unit tests and executable examples is another form of documentation, and is actually a very reasonable way to see about your code, how your code works, how somebody else's code works, and how the code is expected to run. If you have a set of unit tests, that can be a really good way to see, does this code still run as it should? What does this code actually do? And those are all important questions to make sure that you have answered. Now, documentation and accessibility. When you are writing your documentation, you have to keep in mind the other people that will be reading your documentation. Think about things like people who are colorblind, low vision, use a screen reader. These people will also need to use your documentation. And I would like to point out, just because somebody might not be colorblind, low vision, use a screen reader, having accessible documentation, still very useful for them. Screenshots are helpful, but they should never be your only source of information. Screenshots should be described, they should have alt text, and they should be used to illustrate what you are talking about so that if somebody prefers screenshots, they have that way of figuring it out. And if somebody ends up preferring words, they have that way of figuring it out. Keeping a document accessible is better for everyone. The example that I'm going to use here is subtitles. Subtitles are something that were originally for people that could not hear what was going on for whatever reason, subtitles and closed captioning. However, they end up being actually really useful for a lot of people in a lot of scenarios. Maybe you're somewhere where you can't have noise. There you go, subtitles. Maybe you're starting to lose your hearing. There you go, subtitles. Maybe you are doing this in a different language and it's a real struggle because it's not your native language. Subtitles. Now you have the option of being able to see what's happening as well as hear what's happening, do subtitles in a different language, and having that accessibility is just more helpful for everybody. You don't know who's going to read your documentation. Don't make assumptions. Don't make somebody ask for special treatment. Somebody should not have to come and tell you, please give me alt text for your images. You should have alt text for your images by default. It is useful for everybody. Make it accessible by default. Don't make people come and ask you for that. AI can be helpful for documentation. AI can actually do things like help you organize your documentation and thoughts. You can use it as sort of a sounding board so you can talk to it about the documentation. It can help you turn your documentation into other formats. One of the things that AI is actually very reasonable for is doing things like taking your documentation and having a different voice read it, or if you have something that is done by voice, having the AI transcribe it. That's actually a reasonable use. AI can also be helpful for starting out things like script programs, apps to include best practices, making sure that you have a start on everything. You can say to an AI, hey, I'm going to be making this application. I need 10 files across these 3 folders, and I need all of these files to have blah, blah by default, and sort of having that direct English language or whatever language you happen to speak or write version and asking the AI to get it started for you might be a reasonable way to do this. Now, caveat here, this will depend on if it is a class assignment. If it's a class assignment and your professor says don't use AI, spoiler alert, don't use AI. AI can help you keep documents up to date, and it can check the validity of some types of documentation. So doing something like having a bunch of unit tests and then having the AI check your unit tests every day, week, month, quarter, whatever, is a reasonable use of AI. It's kind of like a cron job, but slightly more useful if you've ever used a cron job. If you haven't, cron job, really useful tool. If you run Linux, I guess. If you don't run Linux, I question your life choices. If an AI is aware of your documentation, it can actually use that information to be able to give you some answers or spit back chunks of information. So if you have all of your documentation uploaded to an AI, let's say you're a company, you can actually make a chatbot based off of just that documentation, and it can answer some basic questions and then give you the relevant documentation back as quotes. I have a caution and a warning. Caution 1, junk in, junk out. Documentation quality matters a lot with an AI. If you have crappy documentation, an AI is not going to fix it for you. It is not going to realize that you have crappy documentation. It can't tell. It will try to tell, it will lie to you, but it can't. It just can't. And so you have to make sure that you actually have good quality documentation. If the entire company has absolutely awful documentation, a chatbot is not going to magically fix it. 2, and this is a big warning, AI is not perfect. AI hallucinates. Don't just blindly assume it worked. Check everything. Read, listen to what the AI gives you. Don't just say, oh, I'm sure the AI was right. It's no, bad choices, bad choices. We're seeing all kinds of times where people are using an AI. They are not checking what it's actually saying. They're just using it and blindly being like, oh, I'm sure the AI is right. It's not. You have to actually read what the AI is telling you. Make sure that it is actually founded in real facts. It is actually looking at the correct source of documentation. If you ask an AI, how do I troubleshoot this thing in my server? Even if you specify it's an Ubuntu server, the AI might just be like, oh, well, you're obviously going to want to update your, YAML. Well, cool. Maybe you don't actually have YAML installed. Maybe it will tell you that you want to update something in your CentOS server, and it actually tells you to use apt-get, and you're like, cool, cool, that's real helpful. So you have to actually read what the AI is telling you to do, make sure that you are checking it and it's reasonable. Okay, some software suggestions. Now, software suggestions for documentation. The first one is version control. I'll use the example of GitHub because it's really popular. You can do a free account. Version control allows you to keep track of the changes to your documentation, code, whatever. You can have a short note of what was changed. You can roll back if the changes were problematic. So at any point along the line, you can always roll back to any previous change. It ensures a consistent record. There are timestamps, signatures, and authentication for every change. It doesn't just say this document was changed. Cool. This document was changed by on this date. This was the reason why in their commit message. Wikis are a really popular form of documentation. A lot of companies will use them. I'll use the example of Confluence. Wikis, I'm sure you've all seen Wikipedia. That's a wiki. Multiple people can edit and improve the document. It's supposed to make sure that the one source of truth in the documentation will make the organization of it easier because everybody is dumping all of their knowledge to that one spot and sort of crowdsourcing the whole thing. A third source of documentation that you can use is something called an issue tracker. I used the example of Jira or Linear. What an issue tracker does is it's kind of like sort of think help desk tickets. It gives visibility into issues. Here are the tickets that are coming in. Here are the issues that we are tracking. Now, these could be help desk tickets from outside the company. It could be issues that we're tracking from inside the company. It could be things we've brought up in our scrums, whatever it happens to be. And you can see what's getting changed, updated, why it was getting changed, updated, and the reasoning behind that will all get written down so you can pay attention to that and you can say like, oh, okay, well, these changes happened in my documentation because, and then this was done by, and having that extra information can be really helpful so that you have a better picture of what's actually happening, why it's happening, and the thought process behind that. Especially when you have to work with a lot of people or on a team or something, that can be really helpful. So that is documentation. I hope this was helpful to everybody, and I hope you're all having a lovely day.